Good evening, welcome. So glad to have you all here tonight. Welcome to this evening's presentation. My name is Alan Lowe, and I'm humbled and honored to be the newly appointed Executive Director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Before coming to Springfield last Friday, I served for the past 7 years as the Director of the George W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum in Dallas, Texas. And before that, I spent most of my professional career in the world of presidential libraries and museums. So I'm really, really thrilled to be here. As I said, I've only been here a few days, but I've had such a warm reception from our great staff here, our volunteers, foundation, state colleagues, and of course, our terrific guests. My wife, Kathy, our daughter, Carolyn, and I look very much forward to settling in, getting to know you all, and becoming active members of this wonderful Springfield community. I'm really pleased with the superb programming that this library and museum puts out, and I know that this evening's presentation on trench warfare in the Western Front during the First World War is going to be gripping. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your support of this wonderful institution. And with that, please welcome Dr. Mark DePue. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. It is very much appreciative that you have all come out tonight. It's probably a little bit too hot to be outside today, but I can guarantee even if you were outside, you'd be a whole lot less miserable than the soldiers we're going to be talking about today. Trench warfare has been a kind of a perverse fascination of mine for quite a long time. World War I in general has, and most people who are interested in World War I, that's not necessarily the subject that draws them in. But it has always been a fascination of mine, in part, just like it was for the Civil War. It's impossible for me to understand how the soldiers did what they did over these long periods of time. And what I hope to be able to accomplish today is give you a sense of exactly why they got bogged down in the trench warfare like they did, and what it was like for the average soldier, and the challenges for the generals trying to figure out how to break out of those trenches. I probably have mentioned this in previous presentations, the one I did a couple years ago. I think the First World War is the most important historical event of the last 200 years, since the French Revolution. Most people would think that doesn't make a lot of sense, that it should be World War II or something else. But in my mind, World War II is an extension of World War I, and the revolutions that occurred afterwards, the breakup of several empires after the First World War, the redesigning of the world because of the Treaty of Versailles, explain why I feel that way. In fact, what's been the headline news for the last few years? Things that have been happening in the Middle East. When were those country boundaries drawn? At the end of the First World War. But tonight, it's a little bit different. We're going to be talking about that in a later presentation. But tonight, it's to get a sense of why it was so traumatic for Europe, for France and England and Germany in particular, to have this incredible level of violence and destruction and loss of life like you saw in the First World War. So, very quickly, you probably have seen this slide before if you've been to other ones. This is not exactly the Schlieffen Plan, but it gives you a good idea of what the Germans were trying to accomplish in the initial phase in 1914. The sweeping attack, it was supposed to envelop Paris and crush the French army, but first, of course, you had to go through Belgium. And once you go through Belgium, you have violated Belgian neutrality, and that's what brings the British into the war. So August 2nd, the Germans invade. By August 4th, you have the United Kingdom declaring war. By September 5th, you have the Battle of the Marne beginning to take shape, where the French are finally recouping their losses and regaining themselves and hunkering down for a long fight with the Germans. And that's what they were able to do. September 5th through September 12th, you have the Battle of the Marne. And then after the Battle of the Marne, this is a very, very quick overview for 1914, what you have is the race to the sea. Now, Up to this point in 1914 in the fall, what you have is a series of maneuvers on a massive scale with the enemy, the two sides, always trying to outmaneuver each other and get that particular advantage so that you could attack in the flanks or overwhelm them. Now what you have a solid line and then a series of envelopments all trying to get around the flank of the enemy. So first the French would try to get around the flanks of the Germans and they would be able to extend the line. The Germans would try to do the same thing. The French would extend the line, and they kept trying to do that until they got to the North Sea. And at that point in time, you had a solid line of trenches. And the challenge from here on out is for the generals to figure out a way to bust through the trenches, to get into open terrain, because they believed in the value of mobility and maneuver. And you could only win a decisive battle if you could do that. Punch through the lines, get behind, and envelop, make the enemy respond to what you're doing. So we're going to see from 1914 all the way to 1918 this continual struggle trying to figure out how to break out of these trenches. Once that happens and you get to the sea, the obvious reaction then for the soldiers is to dig in. The Germans were really the first ones to dig in. So here's the Germans up on top here. They had the advantage since they had occupied almost all of Belgium and a significant part of France, to include much of its industrial and mining capacity. They chose the best ground, high ground, dry ground in most cases. They could back up until they found that. And they were serious about digging in. Their trenches, especially initially, were much better constructed. Whatever the engineering prowess of the Germans that we normally think of. But I think more importantly, they planned to stay there. They were not going to go back on the offensive for a little while. They knew they were going to have to defend themselves. On the other side, you've got the French and the Brits who are also going to be digging in. Their mentality is quite different, especially the French. Their mentality was, we need to push the Germans, the dreaded Huns, out of the sacred soil of France. They know they're going to have to go on the offensive to do that. So they don't dig quite as elaborate trench systems. All of this is happening in 1914. 1915, you see the armies moving back and forth. Primarily the Germans were on the Eastern Front, going after the Russians in that year. But both the French and the British tried offensives. The French on a larger scale because the Brits didn't have much of an army. We'll get into that in just a second. It became obvious by the end of 1915 that for whatever reason, the defense had the great advantage. And here's a quote that I wanted to share with you here before we go too much farther. The comment that was made by one author in trying to understand why it was that we got to this stage when this incredible era of enthusiasm and excitement and innovation had occurred before World War I. It happened now that we got bogged down in this war. His comment, Max Brooks's comment, the children of the Renaissance in the age of reason and in the Enlightenment ended up massacring themselves in the mud and the blood of the trenches. So in part, it's our job tonight to try to understand that. The thing I want to keep in mind for all of us here as we go forward in trying to understand why the defense was supreme during this war is to try to understand what had happened in the 40 or 50 years before that. If we think in our generation, we're all convinced that we have seen this technological innovation and advance like no other generation in the world had ever seen. We would be wrong. Because the generation that was born perhaps in the 1860s and came of age and were still alive during the First World War, and certainly the soldiers that fought it, they had seen incredible changes. And just to give you a sense of that, we all know that by the Civil War, railroads had made a huge impact on the nature of warfare, and the telegraph had made a huge impact as well. This is the dawn of the industrial age, where we're seeing it come to fruition. What happens after the Civil War? Here's just a few. 1876, the invention of the telephone. That will factor in a big way in trench warfare. Later 1870s, you've got the impact of electricity. And really the innovation that launches it all is the light bulb. Edison is kind of taking advantage of a lot of other inventions, but 1879 he finally comes up with the right filament so the light bulb can last for a long enough time. And think of the impact just of electricity on our lives today and how that changed everything in the world. Here's another one that we sometimes overlook: the growth of the chemical industry, and especially in terms of explosive power. Dynamite's invented in 1866. Smokeless powder. Sounds like a little thing. It's very big for the First World War. 1884. If you recall, in the Civil War era, after you fire a few volleys of artillery, and especially your rifled muskets, it's hard to see what's going on in the battlefield. That's much less an issue now. Cordite, another explosive, 1889. Vaccines are starting to become more prevalent. So in the First World War, we're saying this is the first war where combat casualties exceed deaths from disease and illnesses. So that's significant as well. Motor vehicles really got a launch in 1886 when Carl Benz figured out how to develop a vehicle that he could produce at a decent scale and then start to sell. Think of the impact that just motor vehicles is going to have on our society today, but even at that time. Photography had been developing over the 19th century. By 1895, it's not just photography. You saw so much more of it in the First World War and capturing so much more of the movement, but you also have motion pictures by that time. And it's a relatively mature industry by the time you get to the beginning of the First World War. Radio, 1902, another huge innovation. Although there's a cautionary tale on radio because it really doesn't impact what goes on in the battlefield until you get to the Second World War. And finally, the one that we always think about, 1903, and the Wright brothers and the first flight. And that's certainly going to change how warfare is as well. But we still haven't touched on what it is that's getting the battlefield to be so much bloodier and so much more dangerous. And it starts with the evolution of the rifle. The musket, what we had for centuries, and still a significant percentage of Confederate soldiers especially, and some Union soldiers in the Civil War, had muskets. But as we know, most Civil War soldiers had rifled muskets. So it took the max range from 200. Just having that rifling in the tube, you can get a much greater muzzle velocity and much better stability of the round going out. So it takes it from 200 to 1,000 yards. And for most of us, it's tough to see past 1,000 yards. Try to do that. The problem, and here's the big change for the Civil War, from 1 round a minute for a musket, because you had to cram that thing down, to 3 rounds per minute. That's a huge increase. But now there's another revolutionary step that's being taken. You've got breech loaders. Instead of putting the round down the muzzle, you're loading it through the breech, and you have smokeless powder. And look at the difference in ranges we have. The German 1898 Mauser, 2,200, way beyond what you can typically see. An effective range, not 200, but 550 yards. Now, if you can see the enemy that far out, moving across no man's land, you can engage them. And if you're a good shot, you can probably take them out. The French model was Lebel and a Lee Enfield for the Brits. These numbers over here, the rate of fire, a very subjective number when I started doing research because it involved a couple things. Did you take time to aim? If you take time to aim, it's a different story. There's a second or two at least that you've got to do to work that through. And you have to change your magazine. So a 5-round magazine is what the Germans had. The Lebel had an 8-round magazine tube that was rather awkward. They came out with a Berthier rifle a little bit later, but it was only 3 rounds. And that's a disadvantage over a 5-round because you got to fumble and change all of this. And then the Lee Enfield. Now, I've seen as much as for the Lebel that it could fire 34 rounds a minute. I don't know how you could do that, changing this thing out every once in a while. and at least making some rough attempt at aiming. So still, look at the difference between what you had in the Civil War and here. The lethality of the battlefield has increased exponentially. And those serried ranks of Civil War soldiers that they saw in 1861, marching across in close ranks, well, that's a thing of the past. Now the best thing to do is to spread out a little bit and move much more quickly across the battlefield. Still, there are other things that factor into this as well. The machine gun. That's the thing that usually comes to mind for people about the First World War, the impact of the machine gun. The Gatling gun was something that was being experimentally used at the very tail end of the Civil War, never really made an impact on battle. But Sir Hiram Maxim, here's an interesting personality. He's an American who actually moves to England when he's 41 years old. He is credited as being the inventor of the first effective water-cooled machine gun in 1884. It's 60 pounds, so it's not light. It's belt-fed 7.92 millimeter caliber weapon. That should sound familiar. We still use that kind of caliber in much of our weaponry today. Water-cooled, 500 rounds permitted, as long as your crew can keep feeding those belts into the machine gun. And a well-trained crew then can sweep the battlefield back and forth to the point where you can't hide from this. You've got to start digging or hunker down. Maximum range, effective range of 3,800 yards, so even farther out. And it developed a couple interesting nicknames that really is illustrative of the impact of the machine gun. The English called it the lawnmower. Now think about that, the lawnmower. Excuse me, that was the French term. The English called it the devil's paintbrush. Now, every country, by the time you get to the First World War, had some variation of the machine gun. This is the German. It's very close to what the Maxim original design was. The Vickers machine gun for the Brits was very close to the Maxim design to begin with. You also have the French Hotchkiss, and you've got the British Lewis machine gun. Now notice one difference here between the Lewis gun, smaller caliber, air-cooled, and the German Maxim gun. It's much smaller, it's much lighter, and therefore it's going to be much easier to move into no man's land with this and to move forward with the advancing infantry. That's going to be increasingly important as you go down the road. So, here's the real killer of World War I, and we sometimes lose track of this. Now, you'll have to forgive me, my early profession as a field artillery officer might show through on this. Improvements in artillery. It's staggering to think of the impact on this one. Artillery kills something like 60% of the casualties in the First World War. Rifled artillery, much like rifled firearms, it's going to have a big impact on the range and the muzzle velocity. You have breech loading. Instead of having to load through the barrel, you're loading through the breech. You have encased ammunition. Instead of putting a ball in and then a piece of powder behind that as a separate action, you can have it all in one encased. The bullet, the primer, the propellant is all in one encasement. And that's going to load much more quickly. You also have time fuses. It's a little bit early in the development of it. There's going to be a huge problem for the Brits later on. But this is something that is certainly achievable by the time. And what you want to do is to have an airburst so that shrapnel flies and kills the enemy as they're moving across open fields. Smokeless powder. And here's the big one. The last two are really the big ones. Recoil system. You think about, if you're watching an old Civil War movie and they're halfway accurate, you see the artillery round go off, and there goes the cannon backwards. And then they have to haul it back up again to put it into battery, put it back into position. And how accurate is it going to be the next time? Is the round going to land anywhere close to it was the first time? That's the challenge. The French were the first ones to really develop this with the 75 millimeter gun that they've got right up here. And you've got this pneumatic brake recoil system. So a mixture of oil, and air, and the round is loaded, the round is fired, and that causes the recoil to occur. But because of the pneumatic system, it comes right back into battery again, almost immediately. This took an awful lot of time and development. This took a lot of different people working on that kind of a concept, but it was absolutely revolutionary after they achieved it. In fact, if you know anything about the Dreyfus Affair, which roiled French politics for a decade or more, the core of that whole incident was the possibility that the Germans were getting this secret about the recoil system, some of the pieces of the recoil system. That's how important the French thought this was. Now, a good crew could fire this weapon. 6,500 meters was the range, approximately 4+ miles in range, much farther than a typical Civil War cannon could fire at the time. Half the range if it was a time fuse, but that's not a problem. You're going to land those in no man's land typically. But here's the interesting part. The max rate of fire was determined to be 30 rounds per minute. In other words, you pull the lanyard, the round goes out, it immediately comes back into battery, you open the breech, you slam in another round, and just that quick. And if you have a trained crew, you can really put down a lot of firepower very quickly. That's part one of this new incredible revolution in artillery. Part two is the indirect fire. Because now with the range that you had in these weapons, and some larger caliber weapons had a greater range, you're not right on the front lines. You're a mile or so behind the front lines. You can't see where your rounds are landing. So you have to have somebody, a forward observer, some way of figuring out where the round has landed. And then you've got to pass that information back to the firing battery and let them know, adjust to left, go out farther in range. In artillery lingo, that's quadrant and deflection. Quadrant for range, deflection for moving it left and right. And it gets to be a very scientific way that you're passing that information back. If you're in a fixed position, you've got telephone wires that are hooking the front line positions with you. But again, how far can you see from the front lines? Maybe a kilometer. Maybe it's tough to even see that far, what's going on. So we're going to find out a little bit more about that in the future. One of the authors I read about the improvements in artillery made this comment. Firepower, artillery firepower, had increased exponentially in range, accuracy, and lethality. But battlefield communications had not improved since Julius Caesar invaded Gaul. It's a little bit of a stretch. You had the telephone, but that's not going to work once you advance into no man's land. And again, more on that a little bit later. So, what are the soldiers to do now that they've got these much improved rifles? They've got machine guns sweeping no man's land. They've got artillery that's bombarding into no man's land. They dig in. And here's a little quiz for the audience here. What do you suppose these German soldiers are looking for? Yeah, ticks, but especially lice. The soldier's constant companion in the trenches. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I want to paint a picture, if you will, for what life is like for these soldiers. And in many cases, they're living here for days or weeks on end in the trenches. Maybe not in the first line trenches, but in the trench system someplace. They have a couple constant companions. Rats are a huge problem. You have lice and obviously nits. In areas where you have a high water table, you had to deal with that. And as you got closer to the coast, you had a higher water table in many cases. And you see some films oftentimes of these soldiers just constantly bailing out the trenches as they go. Well, what's the consequence of that? Trench foot. And what happens when you get to November and December and January? Then you have severe problems with that. And when the rains come, then this whole thing turns into a morass, and all these nice revetments start to be serious problems as well. And if you don't have sandbags or this kind of a lattice work holding up the sides of the trenches, then you've got even bigger problem. There was a pervasive smell in being in the trenches. how would you smell if you didn't get a chance to take a shower or a bath for a couple weeks on end, and the latrines were just a few feet behind, and you had to run and cover in that? And then you've got occasional gas, which we'll get into a little bit. And worst of all, once you got into a battlefield scenario and serious fighting, then you probably have decaying flesh. Maybe it's rats, maybe it's human flesh that you can't really get to. And that's the pervasive smell that you have to deal with. Still, the trenches were much better than being out in the open. What's the alternative? As far as they were concerned, there was no alternative. So they resorted to the trenches. And just a little bit here in terms of the description, this first picture is not a real good representation in one respect. A typical trench would be much deeper than this. It would probably be somewhere from 10 to 12 feet deep, and then you'd have to step up to the firing line and perhaps stand on that or perhaps kneel on that so you could fire out. After the trench system got stabilized, the last thing you typically want to do is to stick your head and expose your head out there, because the enemy would send people out into no man's land, snipers, and take pot shots at anybody they happen to see. So that's what a typical trench might look like, except it would be much deeper, and we'll see some more pictures that will illustrate that. Now, here is the trench system, because the initial assumption that we would all have is it's one continuous line of one trench. That was absolutely not the case at all. It would be a system of trenches. And because of artillery rounds possibly landing in the trench, you can see the nature of the design of these trenches that were actually dug. A zigzag pattern, a herringbone pattern, anything that would prevent a round landing in one part of the trench, taking out a huge line of people in that trench. By defensive, that you would absolutely have to do that. Now, to get a little bit closer look at this, a closer look, here you have the first line of trenches. Here you have a communications trench that connects these two, and this is the one that the soldiers would move back and forth, and probably somewhere along here would be located the latrines out of harm's way, perhaps. Oftentimes, the troops would be more concentrated in the second line of trenches and thinly populating the first line, just because they were assumption that would be more dangerous there. You also see a communications trench, a sap that's going out into no man's land, and this is most likely a listening post here. And it's subtle, but anybody guess what these three lines might be right here? That's your bands of barbed wire, correct. And that was another feature of the First World War. So on the left, that's the kind of defenses you would have at Petersburg. And for those of you who were participating in the Civil War presentations, you know by the time you get to 1865, it's trench warfare, because even the lethality of the weapons at that time. And how do you slow down the enemy? You have abatis or something like this, or a line of sticks in the ground trying to impede the advance. You didn't have to worry about that in World War I with the invention of barbed wire, of course, an American invention. Why was it invented? For farm use, for ranching use. It was first used in warfare during the Spanish-American War. It was used in the Sino-Soviet War, between the Sino-Japanese War, Sino-Japanese War in the early 1900s. And during the Boer War, the British actually used it for concentration camps. So it had a multiple ways of being used, but it really found its use during the First World War as well. And here's the challenge. Let's say you are crossing no man's land, and then you encounter these kinds of obstacles, and you get hung up in the obstacles, and not too many yards away is that German machine gun firing away at you. So a huge problem, and what to do with the wire, how to get rid of the wire before you actually advance in the first place. Now, you've already heard me talk about artillery, but I wanted to get a sense of the kind of artillery that drove people into the trenches in the first place, and now different kind of artillery that's going to be employed because they are in the trenches. Difference between guns and the howitzers: a gun generally is a high velocity weapon of flat trajectory. And oftentimes, when you think about a tank that has a gun on it, you can typically see the target you're shooting at. Howitzers is a little bit lower muzzle velocity, typically a higher trajectory. The advantage in trench warfare is you want to have it coming up. If you're going to attack the trenches, troops in the trenches, you want it coming straight down instead. So over time, you're going to see more and more heavier artillery being used. Here is the British 8-inch. Certainly the Germans had their equivalent of field howitzers of that scale. The Germans also, because they started the war with the assumption that they had to take out major fortifications in Belgium and France, had developed these huge siege weapons. Well, you can't put that behind a bunch of horses and drag it along. You have to maneuver it around with probably in a rail line in almost all cases. And that means it's not going to be moved quickly. But if you have a very stable front, this is the kind of weapon you want to be able to use more than anything else. The Germans start the war with a big advantage in the number of machine guns per unit, and especially in the number of heavy artillery that they had. Now you've got a weapon that can go after troops in trenches, go after bunkers. And both sides didn't just dig trenches, they dug bunkers. And again, especially the Germans, they dug a very elaborate system of bunkers that they would hide in during an enemy artillery barrage until the end of the barrage, and then they'd come out of the bunkers and man the trenches afterwards. So that's what you've got here. And counter-battery fire. In other words, you'd rather take out the enemy's artillery before they blast you. And that takes a level of sophistication, knowing where the enemy artillery is. How do you possibly see where the rounds are landing in the first place if the enemy batteries are a mile behind the front line trenches? We'll get to that in just a minute. Here's another way to make life very miserable for soldiers during World War I, and that's gas warfare. Tear gas was the first used in 1914 on a limited scale on the Russian front. By 1915, the Germans had developed chlorine gas. It was a visibly greenish cloud moving across the battlefield. You could see it coming, which was something of an advantage, obviously, but it would be very intimidating. And when it was first employed, it terrified the Brits that was being used against at Ypres. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's wipers, I think is how the Brits actually pronounce it. It's a French word. Anyway, in Flanders area. And the Germans weren't really prepared to exploit the advantage they had from that first deployment. But then everybody starts using it afterwards. Chlorine is nasty stuff, but it's not quite as bad as phosgene, which was also developed and employed first in December of 1915. And it had a different smell than the chlorine gas did. And the disadvantage and advantage both at the same time. It really didn't take effect. If a soldier was contaminated with phosgene, it didn't take effect for about 24 hours. So they could actually fight and resist while the gas was first being employed. But once it kicked in, because of that, then actually most deaths due to gas during the First World War are due to phosgene. Now, the one we hear so much about is mustard gas, which is beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, 1917, and that also is nasty, nasty stuff, because whatever part of your body is exposed to it, it's burned. So if you breathe it in, it burns your lungs. If you get it in your eyes, and think about it, how often do you sit there and rub your eyes about something, and especially in your kind of environment that they're in? It gets in your eyes. That's the kind of thing you're seeing right here. Nasty stuff, causing serious blistering. Mortars and grenades. As the fighting starts to get more sophisticated, they're adjusting their tactics. They're adjusting the kind of weapons that they use. And increasingly, mortars are handy things to have. You can move them farther forward. This one obviously has a fairly big punch, this German mortar. A lot of the mortars that were used were much smaller and therefore easier to go out into no man's land and carry. It's still a pretty heavy object to be hauling out there, especially when you're taking ammunition along with you. Other new weapons, grenades, trench knives, pistols, carbines, shotguns. Because quite frankly, those long rifles that we were showing to begin with, once you get in the trench, it's not real practical. Especially when you've got that long bayonet on top of it. You want a shorter carbine, you want to have a shotgun or something like that, and when you're mixing up in the trenches, some nasty looking trench knives that would develop as well. Just to give you a scale of how some of this is going to impact warfare, the Brits manufactured 75 million of these bombs. Mills bombs is what they were called. 75 million of them. And that's just one country. All the nations were doing the same kind of thing. Okay, now back to the problems of observation on the battlefield, the challenge that the artillery especially had if you're going to use it effectively. We always think about aircraft and we think about the glamour. If there is anything that's glamorous about the First World War, I suppose it's about air warfare, aerial combat between two fighter aircraft. That's not what the aerial warfare was really all about, especially initially. Hydrogen-filled balloons used for observation, used to adjust fire. You get high enough, you're far enough back, you're probably out of the range of the enemy, and you can see the battlefield. How do they communicate? They'd have a cable tethered from the balloon all the way to a truck on the ground, and then that would be relayed back to the firing batteries. Sometimes you'd have fixed-wing aircraft going out for observation as well. How did they get that message back? Well, signal flags, dropping notes down, a variety of different ways. Again, communication was a big problem during the war. So once you have this kind of an object in the air, hydrogen-filled, think about the implications of that, obviously it becomes a major target. And that's where your fixed-wing aircraft come in, and that's going to evolve rather quickly as well. They would carry metal darts that they would drop on the enemy and trying to hit them in the trenches. They would drop hand grenades, and then they started to drop bombs and things like that as well. But they especially wanted to attack these observation aircraft, whatever they be, either balloons or other aircraft in the air. Because if you control the air and you control observation, that makes your artillery much, much more effective. And as we said before, that's the real killer of the war. And by the time you get to late 1916, now you see this aerial combat between two aces going after each other. But that's the transition that you're getting, and that's the reason that the air war is so important to begin with. Okay, now that I've set the stage, hopefully, to give you an idea of what the nature of trench warfare was all about, why they got bogged down in the trenches, what they were trying to do to break out of the trenches, it's now time to transition here and talk about Verdun and then the Somme. It's kind of an illustration of the way this actually worked. And both of these battles are in 1916. The Battle of Verdun lasted from February 21st to December 18th, 1916. 9 months. Now, obviously, the level of intensity varied from day to day, but 9 months that they were exposed to this kind of intense combat. And Verdun, if you're a Frenchman, especially a Frenchman of that period of time, was both a battle that you took intense pride about because the French ended up being victorious. I guess they could describe it that way. But also incredibly painful experience because of the level of casualties that they experienced. And this map here illustrates better than anything I know just how futile this combat was. You see the two shaded areas. In the south, this is where the Battle of Verdun occurred. It's going to be a German offensive in 1916. We'll get to the details here in a bit. But look how little terrain actually changed ground after 9 months of combat. And actually, the Germans gained that, and then they lost it again to the French in most cases. and for the Battle of the Somme, which isn't quite as long but even more deadly. You can see how little terrain actually changed hands in the Battle of the Somme. In the grand scheme of things, it was minuscule. You start to wonder then, if you're your average soldier, the futility of what you're doing. Erich von Falkenhayn, he takes over as the commander, the commander in charge of the German forces after Helmut von Moltke basically comes close to a nervous breakdown in September of 1914. Then Falkenhayn is going to take over. He's your typical Prussian career soldier. He was the Prussian chief of staff, not the German, the Prussian chief of staff at the beginning of the war. He is the descendant of Teutonic Knights. Doesn't he look every bit the soldier in this picture right here? He had a reputation of being stern and severe, somewhat visionary. He had a different vision than many of the other officers did. And why should this be any different from most places? He was somewhat of a favorite of the Kaiser's court as well, so it didn't hurt to be popular in political circles at the time. He thought that the war had to be won in the West, that you couldn't win it against Russia because such a vast amount of terrain that you had to conquer in Russia, that the whole German army could get swallowed up there. It had to be won in the West. And the target was probably the French. If you could figure out a way to take the French army out and then isolate the Brits, well, how do you do that? He did not necessarily believe that you could have a breakthrough. His experiences in the East, and especially seeing what had happened in the Western Front in 1915, led him to believe that that would be very, very difficult. What he decided then to do was to find a spot on the map that the French people and the French brass would have so much, what's the right word to use here? That they would value so much that they would never want to sacrifice it, that they would bleed themselves white defending that spot on the map rather than turn it over to the Germans. And what Falkenhayn found was Verdun, an old fortress city dating back into the early 19th century. It was one of the fortresses that the Germans had actually conquered in the Franco-Prussian War about a couple generations before. It was a point of intense pride for the French people as well. And so, on a very narrow front, what Falkenhayn plans to do is to mass his artillery, especially his field artillery, and then punch his way through with that field artillery and have the French army then bogged down in this fight at Verdun. Now, there's a lot of debate in terms of exactly what his intentions were, because he wrote about this afterwards in his memoirs, and he kind of wrote about it from the perspective of what had actually happened, trying to argue his case. But I think there is some merit to the things that most historians would believe in terms of having this massive fight of attrition, that maybe he didn't even want to seize Verdun city itself, that wasn't important, because if you seize the city, then the French would back away, and they wouldn't keep committing forces to that. The key was to have the French keep funneling their troops into this fight. So here is a quote from his memoirs after the war that Falkenhayn wrote.
If we succeed in opening the eyes of the French people to the fact that in a military sense they have nothing more to hope for, England's best sword would be knocked out of her hand. To achieve that object, the uncertain method of a mass breakthrough, in any case beyond our means, is unnecessary. We can probably do enough for our purposes with limited resources. Within our reach, behind the French sector of the Western Front, there are objectives for the retention of which the French General Staff would be compelled to throw in every man they have. If they do so, the forces of France will bleed to death, as there can be no question of a voluntary withdrawal, whether we reach our goal or not.
So a little bit more specifics on this. As far as heavy artillery is concerned, the Germans are going to devote 542 heavy guns, large caliber guns, some of these as large as the Big Bertha we saw in the last picture. 306 field pieces on this very narrow front, so 1,300 guns altogether once they had everything lined up. They had some 420 millimeter mortars, the big Berthas. They had 15-inch naval guns that they were bringing in on rail cars. And they had 305 millimeter mortars as well. They also established air superiority for the reasons I had just talked about. So they could dominate the skies and they could dominate the observation, make their artillery that much more effective. Stormtrooper tactics. They are starting to evolve different tactics and employing smaller level units, not company or battalion sized forces moving across together, but smaller groups of squad or platoon level, anywhere from 10 to 40 people, moving across the battlefield, highly skilled, trained to maneuver, given more initiative than the average infantryman would be so they can respond to the situation they see, and especially go after the strong points that are identified. They had a new weapon as well. They had flamethrowers that they introduced in this battle. And there's another very terrifying weapon if you're on the receiving end, to see that tongue of flame coming towards you also. They knew that the French would counterattack. And the hope then was that the French would bleed themselves so badly that they would eventually sue for peace and turn the war over to the Brits. And so now the Germans had to worry about the British Navy and their much smaller British Army as well. So, here's the opposite side, the French side of it. General Joseph Jafra served as the commander-in-chief of the French forces until later in 1916. He was the commander-in-chief during the early stages of the war. He led them through the first initial stage of total disaster for the French as they retreated beyond their borders. He led them to victory in the Battle of the Marne, the miracle of the Marne. So he's somewhat of a hero to the French people. He's an artilleryman and engineer by training, but he, like most Frenchmen, is a strong disciple of the offensive. That was one of the tragedies of 1914 especially. They believed in the offensive so much that they sacrificed hundreds of thousands of French soldiers in trying to get a successful offense going. So he's the architect of that, but again, he's also the architect of the Battle of the Marne, known as Papa Jafra, kind of affectionately by the French people. General Henri Philippe Pétain, right here. A different kind of beast altogether. Jafra despised the man. Unlike most of the French officers, he never really got any serious service overseas in the empire. He spent most of the time in France itself. He was not a great fan of the offense. That's what put him at odds with the rest of the French staff and brass most of the time. So he wasn't favored by his superiors. But he is at the point that right at the early stages of this battle, he's going to be given command of the Second Army across from Verdun. He actually believes that cannon conquers and infantry occupies. Cannon conquers, infantry occupies. Well, that's heresy to a guy like Jafra and most of the French. In fact, most of trained officer corps across the European theater by that time. He takes command early in this campaign. He actually has double pneumonia when he first takes command, but he's also a brilliant logistician as well, and that's going to come in very handy in this one. And finally, the third person, Robert Nivelle, right down here. When Pétain is promoted after a couple months of the campaign, Nivelle actually takes command of the Second Army in April. Now, it says Verdun is a quiet sector. That's before the Germans launched their offensive on the 21st of February. In fact, it was so quiet that the French decided to move most of the big guns out of these fortifications. And what Verdun was, it was a series of established, elaborate fortifications with large bunkers, heavily staffed, kitchens, hospitals, the whole works. And much of that had been stripped away because it was a quiet sector. They needed this heavy artillery elsewhere. So it was only partially manned at the opening stages. Now, here's the map of Verdun, a little bit closer view than the one that you initially saw. The initial advance for the Germans is going to be on the west side of the Meuse River, so in this area right here. Dumont right here is the main linchpin fortress that the French had. And you see plenty of other fortresses as you circle Verdun. Val is another one. You've got more along this route right down here, and then battery locations as well, scattered through here. So it's a series of these fortifications, interlocking fire, things like that. That was the key to the success, at least before the World War I actually began. On February 21st, in the morning at dawn, German bombardment begins. Actually, it's at 4 a.m., sorry about that. In just a few hours, the Germans fire 1 million shells against the fortifications and trenches, primarily against the fortifications and the frontline trenches that you've got there. Saturation bombing, intense, meant to shock and destroy and to slaughter any Frenchmen who were in those trenches. At 4:45 p.m., approximately 12 hours later, the German infantry assaults and quickly gain territory as they move from this area towards these fortresses. By the time you get to the 25th is the date that Fort Dumont actually falls, with practically no resistance. So it doesn't take long, just a few days, for the Germans to reach that point. And by this time, the French senior staff, the French people were panicking, because this is a disaster on massive scales. The French soldier, here's one comment I wanted to read of a French soldier about the time now the French are really going to respond to this in a serious way. I came up as a volunteer. I wanted to see Verdun and take part in the great battle. 150 of us left the bivouac. By the time we got up to the line, there were only 30 of us left, and we had not yet met the enemy. Oceans of mud, dark skies, like Golgotha at the hour that Christ died. No trenches up there, only holes, and holes blown into holes, all filled with the stink of the dead, a nightmare with no morning to come. So it gives you a painting, a word painting of exactly what it was like. And just think about it, just trying to get up to the front lines. The enemy artillery is decimating that particular unit before they even get there. And that is a very demoralizing experience, let me tell you. Pétain, over time, is going to rotate his troops frequently. About every 2 weeks, he wants to rotate a unit out and bring a fresh unit in. So eventually, practically every unit in the French army is going to be rotated through this battle that goes on month after month after month. April 30th, he is promoted to command the Army Group Center. That consists of 52 divisions. Think about it, 52 divisions. That's a massive force that he's got under control. Well over 500,000 soldiers. And Robert Nivelle, as I mentioned before, takes over the army. A few weeks later, on June 8th, Fort Val falls to the Germans. And so they keep moving on. And then July and October, once you get to early July, you have the Battle of the Somme. So now you are finally distracting the Germans' attention away from this vortex of violence that you've got in Verdun. But the battle keeps going on month after month after month. Here is the initial German advance. You can see the impact of the flamethrower that they've got. I certainly wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of that. The Sacred Way. This is part of the legend of the Battle of Verdun. Some debate about when that particular phrase, the Sacred Way, actually was coined. Was it during the battle or afterwards? But it was the name for the absolutely crucial supply line. There were rail lines that were eventually being able to be constructed, but primarily it was this road that they were funneling troops and supplies back and forth. And we're talking about on a massive scale, way beyond what we had experienced in the Civil War. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of troops that had to be maintained in those frontline locations. And you can see some of the troops waiting to head up, some of the troops heading up, some supply lines coming in as well. The French poilu, that was the image of the French soldier at the time. He looks older, doesn't he? Got a nice beard on him. The reservists was a very important part of the French army by this time. You know, they had all had initial service in the army, and then they went into the reserves, and they were all called up in those early days of the war back in 1914. Poilu, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, stands for the hairy one. That was the name that they had for their soldiers. So you had doughboys, you got Tommies, you got the Huns, you got the hairy ones, is what the French were called. Here's what, after a while, August 16th, Falkenhayn himself is replaced because the war is not going well at that particular time. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff. These were the heroes of the Eastern Front. These were the heroes of the Battle of Tannenberg back in 1914, of the incredible successes the Germans had in the Russian front in 1915. Now they're going to replace Falkenhayn because his battle of attrition by that time is attriting the German army just as much as it seems to be attriting the French army. So he's out, Hindenburg and Ludendorff are in. And over the next couple years, you're going to see those two gentlemen grow more and more powerful with each and every month. Here's a good quote that gives you a sense of what it was like for the German soldier and the attitude they took towards it. There will be no end of this until the last Frenchman and the last German hobble out of their trenches on crutches to exterminate each other with pocket knives or fingernails. And why would they think anything else? The Germans were stuck there much longer periods of time than the French were, and you've got to feel a sense of resignation. You know, it's not a matter if you're going to survive, it's a matter of when you're going to be killed or injured. That had to be the attitude that they took. October 24th, because of Nivelle's offensives now, he has a much more offensive attitude than Pétain did. He takes Fort Dumont back. It's recaptured. November 2nd, the French recaptured Fort Vaux. And by December 15th, the last major push there, 8 French divisions attack. The battle ends with something like 11,000 Germans surrendering. And it's getting into the winter. And finally, the Battle of Verdun comes to an end. So here's the cost. Here's what it looks like. Here's Fort Dhumal at the beginning of this campaign. Here it is after it's been seriously bombarded, probably sometime during the point in time when the Germans took over that particular fortification. And the Germans occupied in force after that. So you can barely recognize the terrain. But 40 million artillery rounds later, many of them centered at these fortresses that were so contested. Here's what it looks like. And you start to look at that and you try to figure out what it's like for an infantryman to try to run across that terrain. And you start to realize the serious challenges they had in trench warfare. Total involvement, something like 1,140,000 Frenchmen, anywhere from 75 to 85 divisions had cycled through this particular battle. Over 1.25 million Germans from 50 divisions. They tended to stay longer when they did. And now we get to the point of trying to figure out the casualties. And I found trying to determine casualty rates for the First World War even more challenging and frustrating for me than for the Civil War. But here are the numbers for the Battle of Verdun. 162,000 killed or missing for the French, something like 143,000 for the Germans. So yes, the Germans seem to have done better if we can believe their numbers. Take a look at the wounded and then the totals. Slightly more French were casualties in this war than Germans. Here's the challenging part of this, missing. Why do you suppose these soldiers were missing? Well, I think we know why they were missing. Because when they go on these assaults and somehow they die in the middle of no man's land someplace, and you hear these accounts of they fall into a crater, and then an artillery round lands and buries them, and then an artillery round lands and uncovers them again and then another artillery round lands and buries them again. Who's to know what happened to these people? And imagine the anguish then if you're the loved one back home and they don't know what happened. But you can guess. I mean, your imagination dreams up the worst for you. That's the horrors of Verdun, and that's why it had such a psychological impact on it. So having laid out what Verdun was like and having laid out what trench warfare in general was like, I want to kind of go through an anatomy of a battle, and then we'll turn our attention at the Somme itself. And this picture illustrates the kind of destruction that you get with that level of bombardment. So first you have the artillery preparatory fires in the early stages before the initial assault occurs, and its goal is to cut the enemy wire. Now you have to depend on your artillery to do a couple things. This is generally the smaller guns, the 75 millimeter guns, the British and the German equivalents of that. You have to have a good air burst. It's got an air burst at the right elevation. If it's too high, it scatters too much and it's not going to have the impact you want. If the round impacts, you got this nice explosion, but generally what happens is it kind of tosses the wire up and it's still there. So it has to be, you have to have good munitions and you have to have good officers and NCOs who can adjust that fire and make sure it's effective in the first place. And those are two huge ifs. Once you've got that, you generally also want to have the artillery hit the trenches to try to destroy the enemy in the trenches, to try to destroy the enemy in their bunkers, and hopefully they'll never even emerge in the first place. There will be empty trenches or filled with dead by the time you attack. The trench line oftentimes is gassed to push them out as well. And gas can work both ways. I don't think you want to be an infantry advancing into an area that has already been gassed, unless you're absolutely prepared. So you have the infantry that then begins to advance, and let's say that, let's be optimistic, and the infantry occupies the enemy trenches. In the meantime, you've crossed this area. And look, they had to build this road after they crossed it. You can't bring any field artillery. Even a 75 couldn't cross that battlefield until you had some major improvement of the engineers going out there. Imagine being the guy who is the signalman or the wireman who's got a roll of wire that he's hauling across the battlefield to try to connect the frontline troops with the commanders back in the trenches or maybe a mile behind the trenches so you can inform the general officers what's going on. And what do you suppose happened to the wire that's laying on top of the ground? Of course it's cut. And that's why you hear lots of different variations, signal flags, carrier pigeons, but especially runners. One of the most dangerous jobs in the First World War, running back and forth, delivering the messages of what's been happening in the combat, because communication has absolutely broken down. And that's going to be a huge problem. So, especially in the case of the Germans, it was part of their tactics, standard procedure, that if you get attacked, then you stage a counterattack. And of course, it worked both ways, but the Germans were especially good at it. So you can anticipate, you attack, you seize the enemy trenches, and boy, you better be ready for that counterattack because you know it's coming. And if you've only gotten half of your force or a third of your force in those trenches in the first place, what's likely to happen? Your attackers are forced back. This is the pattern that they got to by the time you got to 1916. How do you break through? And it's not just one line of trenches. It's not just two line of trenches. In most cases, it's more than that. You might be able to break through one line of trenches. Then you still have the huge problem of what to do with the other two lines, or the other line. And that takes days to move all this equipment, the supplies up, the artillery up, to reestablish communications before you can launch the next step. And that's why, again, it gets all bogged down. So, let's turn to the Battle of the Somme. But before we do that, what we have to do here is take a look at Britain's new army. Because they start the war, unlike all the continental armies, they had a tiny, tiny regular army. They didn't need one. They had the ocean to protect them. They had the English Channel to protect them. And as we know, they dominated the oceans. The British Navy was the best in the world. The Germans tried to challenge them, but they were nowhere close. The British had 247,000. At the beginning of the war, the Germans and the French armies numbered in the millions. Much of their army was overseas. Only 129,000 was based in England. They did have a territorial force that was kind of like our reserves, based around different places in England. They were hardly up to the standards of the regulars at the time. And the problem with that force of 129,000, most of them got shipped to England in 1914. By the time you got done in 1915, most of those soldiers had been casualties, both the regular force and many of the territorials. Now you have the problem that really kicked off because Lord Kitchener, at the beginning of the war, envisioned, unlike almost everybody else, that this war wasn't going to be over by December, by Christmas time. He envisioned a long war. So by August of 1914, he starts calling for volunteers. And like so many of the young men in the First World War especially, they came in droves with great enthusiasm and signed up. They came at such levels that by 5 months, just by the end of the first year, 1914, 1 million Brits, Englishmen, had signed up and volunteered. 1 year later, by the end of 1915, they had 3 million. But who's left to train them? And how do you equip them? That becomes the real problem. And it doesn't take just a few months, especially if you have guys like me. I've been out of the Army for 15, 20 years. Now they call me up and send me out to do training for these people. And, I knew how it was in the old Boer War, but it doesn't work the same anymore. And I'm out there training them how to march and things like that. But that's only the rudimentary stuff. It's a real challenge. The British Army has to be raised very quickly because guess what France is doing? They're screaming that the Brits get in the war in a much more serious way. Otherwise, their attitude was, yeah, the Brits are fine and they can fight this war until the last drop of French blood. Didn't go over very well for the French, so the Brits were in a big, big hurry. So training is one part of the problem, and you think it's hard for the average infantryman. Imagine how you train officers and NCOs. How do you train engineers? And how do you train all these artillerymen? I talked about how sophisticated that business had become. Well, maybe you have the staff to train them in the first place. What you don't have are rifles and uniforms and any other kind of equipment you can think of. You certainly don't have artillery that they can practice with. All of that stuff was grossly short. Now, one of the things that occurred in 1915, such a scale that they have a name for it, the shell scandal of 1915. Because the armies in Europe, the British Army in France was crying out to be equipped with enough shells that they could fight effectively. And this got to be a major scandal, and it's one of the reasons that David Lloyd George emerged like he did. He became, see if I can find it here. Anyway, he took positions of Lord of the Ministry of Munitions, I believe, something like that. One of the other things that Lord Kitchener did early in the war, he appealed, you can see the classic brochure right here, Britain Needs You. He appealed to communities to raise their own battalions. And all of these soldiers that would join the same battalion then would be able to fight together in this glorious cause overseas. And you don't want to miss the romance of the war. This might be your only chance. And again, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands joined up just on that appeal alone. And that's where you get all these PALS battalions, because all the PALs that joined up together to serve together. And again, if you think about what's going to happen later on, the trauma that's going to cause to these communities is horrendous. Now, as we go through the Battle of the Somme here, one of the things I want to do is focus on the Grimsby Chums. And I'll talk more about them a little bit later. But Grimsby is about 150 miles north of London. It's a fishing village, and it's going to factor into our story as we move along here. Grand strategy. December of 1915, there is a meeting between General French of the British Army, that's a confusion here, General John French of the British Army commands at that time, with Jafra talking about what they want to see happen in 1916. And they want to have joint offensive. They want to have a combined offensive to put as much pressure on the Germans as possible. And oh, by the way, want the Russians to do the same thing and the Ottomans, or excuse me, and the other parts of the empire to do the same thing, the Italians. So that was the initial meeting. Shortly after that, Douglas Haig takes command of the British forces. Douglas Haig is another old soldier, a cavalryman, a Scotsman, disciplined, a disciple of the defense or of the offense again. He's cold, headstrong. Again, he's socially well connected. It never hurts. And he is, if anything, he's tenacious. He's also a veteran of the Boer War and Indian Wars. Now, this is not going to be the same kind of war that he's going to encounter here. And after the war, just kind of a curious note, he's a champion for World War I British veterans. In February 14th, Haig meets Jafra. Now, before it was French meeting Jafra. Now they're going to meet, and this is before, about a week before the German offensive at Verdun. They agree, there's some discussion, the Brits wanted to do it elsewhere, but they finally agreed to have an offensive, a joint offensive on the River Somme with the Brits on the north side, the French on the south side, and the French would be in the lead. They would be the major push. Well, a couple weeks later, everything has changed because the French are fighting for the life in Verdun. So the spring meeting comes, and the warning that Jafra puts out is, if you don't do something now, the British or the French army will cease to exist. And now the British have to be in the lead. So Haig's plan by this time is on a fairly large, broad front, larger than the Germans had envisioned, a broad front of something like 25 kilometers. He's going to attack in phase one. And they're going to have enough artillery to suppress the Germans. And with there's the Brits now in the lead and the French in support. In phase two, they would seize the second line of defenses for the Germans, and possibly then afterwards, if all goes well, have a breakthrough. And just to make sure that you are ready for that, you have a cavalry corps waiting behind the lines, 3 whole divisions of cavalry waiting to exploit that breakthrough. So that's still in their minds. Henry Rawlinson here is the local commander of the 4th Army in that region. He has a little bit different vision of this. He doesn't see that the breakthrough is going to be as possible. He wants to concentrate the firing in a smaller area, and he wants to, his strategy essentially is bite and hold. You get a piece of land and you hold it, and then you start moving things forward again until you can take it over. Of course, eventually Haig's attitude is going to carry the day. Just a little bit about the terrain at the Somme. It is perfect for digging. It's a nice rolling terrain, chalky soil, and it's perfect for digging, and the Germans have done it in a major way. In fact, what they have now, this is kind of hard to see. This is 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, all the way up to 9,000 here. Here's their first line trenches. This is roughly where the British lines are. So these are very close, anywhere from a couple hundred yards to 800 or 900 yards distance from the British lines. That's the first line. And then back here, you've got the second line. You've got all these communications trenches connecting all this stuff. That's probably pushing the limit or outside the limit of most of the British and French guns. So you can't even attack them in the first day. The third line, which the Germans are busily building in early 1916, is way behind, way out of range for the British guns. So that's what the Brits and the French are going to have to deal with in the early stages. I want to take just a quick listen to this. The British bombardment starts. Let me make a couple other comments here first. The British plans 13 divisions, 11 of those in the 4th Army, 2 in the 3rd Army. They will begin the campaign with a week-long bombardment, 1,000 guns, 180 of them heavy guns, so much smaller percentage than the Germans had. And some notion of a rolling barrage. Now, the field artillery, the smaller guns are supposed to cut the enemy wire. The bigger guns are supposed to be counter-battery fire and dig the troops out of the trenches and the bunkers. That's the assumption that they make. And then the plan is to have troops advance over an open terrain, and generally, because the assumption is going to be everybody's dead in the trench line, so you're going to be able to move relatively open and unobstructed. And you've got 60 plus pounds on your back, because that's what you need to fight the war once you get across no man's land. You can't really run with 60 plus pounds on your back in the first place. And sometimes you would be advancing behind a rolling barrage so that the artillery would be moving forward as you move forward. That's tricky business. You better know what you're doing as an artilleryman, and you better have faith in the artillery if you're infantry to do something like that. The French have only 5 divisions, and that's under General Ferdinand Foch. Now, the troops, right before this bombardment occurs and during the initial stage of the bombardment, what are they doing? They're doing everything but training because they don't have time to. They're digging more communications trenches. They're digging in communication lines 6 foot deep so it doesn't get disrupted as you move up to the front lines. You're not digging forward to the front line, obviously. You're bringing all these supplies forward. There's one detail after another. So again, the bottom line is the British troops are not well enough trained for what they're going to be thrown into. The assumption is the artillery will carry the day and the infantry will have the easier time of it. So the bombardment begins on the 24th and it continues afterwards. And here is one German soldier's view of what's going on in those opening moments.
We ran out of food that night and I was sent to get some. At the field kitchen I was told, "Tell your comrades the English will attack tomorrow morning." It took me 7 hours to fetch the food, and when I got back, I couldn't find my dugout because the ground was so torn up. Then I saw one of my friends signaling to me. I told one of my comrades, "We must be prepared. The English will attack soon." We got our machine gun ready at the top step of the dugout, and we put our equipment on, and we waited. We all expected to die. We thought of God. We prayed. Then someone shouted, "They're coming! They're coming!" We rushed up and got our machine gun in position. We could see the English soldiers pouring out at us, thousands and thousands of them. We opened fire.
Now, on the British side, 1.5 million shells had been fired in that preparation over those few days. And as far as the average British infantryman was concerned, how can anybody live through this kind of bombardment? So they had this great optimism. Each corps commander had their own plan that they could adopt accordingly, so there were some variations. The mood in the trenches was very ebullient. They were excited about this. They were looking forward to this in most cases. And I think to illustrate that, I want to get into, in the next slide here, talking about the Grimsby Chums and their example. So, July 1st at 7:30 a.m., the bombardment stops, the infantry attacks. 60,000 troops along a 13-mile front. If you look right here, you can get a good sense of the pack that he's got, the long rifle with the bayonet on top. That's the load that they're going to have to carry. And again, that's your standard infantryman. The wiremen are going to have that spool of wire they're going to be hauling across there as well, and lots of other equipment has to go forward. Some taking sandbags, some taking digging utensils, all kinds of equipment has to go over the top. Into no man's land. Creeping barrage, moving too fast in most cases. In many cases at least, the enemy wire is uncut. In part, that's because something like a third of the British artillery are duds. Mostly a problem with the fuses. A lot of the artillery was manufactured in the United States. I'm not sure where the fuses were manufactured, but that's a huge problem for them. In fact, they're still digging up artillery rounds today, the French farmers are. In fact, I was able to walk across a field a few years back and was very easy just to walk across and start picking up shrapnel that was still on top of the ground after it had been freshly plowed. What was the experience of the chums? Well, here's their experience. 4:30, the chums eat their breakfast along with the issue of rations. 5:30, they move forward to their jump-off positions. And at 6 o'clock, they're in the positions and they break into song. Gives you a sense of their attitudes at that moment. And includes little ditties like, I Love the Ladies. Maybe some of the songs that we heard as we came in here. 6:25, the artillery preparation intensifies. And at 7:28, approximately an hour later, a huge mine had been tunneled by the engineers underneath the German lines and packed with 24 tons of high explosives underneath the German lines. Think about the crater in the Battle of Petersburg, but only much bigger. That huge mine is detonated 2 minutes before they're supposed to attack. Huge explosion. You see this mushroom cloud of dirt and clay being thrown into the air. The only problem is it was short of the German lines. And it was 100 yards wide. Now it becomes nothing but an obstacle for the troops as they move forward. 7:30, companies A, B, and C go over the top. In 4 lines, they advance. They go 10 yards, they drop. They raise up again, they move another 10 yards, they drop. But as they go far enough, some of the soldiers start to realize, well, they're dropping and they're not getting up. And they're not getting up because they've been hit. The great assumption that the Brits, all the way up the chain of command, had was an absolutely falsehood. The Germans were in their bunkers, they emerged from their bunkers, they manned their machine guns, and they were able to call in the artillery, and it became a killing field as far as a lot of the British troops were. Yet, just like clockwork, 9 o'clock, D Company goes in advance, just like they had planned in the first place, experienced the same thing. Only a very small number of chums actually made it to the German trenches, and eventually they're going to be repulsed. Most of the rest, they lay injured in no man's land, or they managed to make their way back to the friendly lines. And in many cases, they didn't make their way back to friendly lines until darkness had occurred. So that was the experience for the chums and much of the rest of the British Army. So let's get a flavor again of some other quotes that here. This one, a German.
When the English started advancing, we were very worried. They looked as though they must overrun our trenches. We were surprised to see them walking. We had never seen that before. I could see them everywhere. There were hundreds. The officers were in front. I noticed one of them walking calmly, carrying a walking stick. When we started firing, we just had to load and reload. They went down in their hundreds. You didn't have to aim. We just fired into them. If only they had run, they would have overwhelmed us.
And from the British perspective.
The trench was a horrible sight. The dead were stretched out on one side, one on top of each other, 6 feet high. I thought at the time I should never get the peculiar, disgusting smell of the vapor of warm human blood heated by the sun out of my nostrils. I would rather have smelt gas 100 times. I can never describe that faint, sickening, horrible smell which several times nearly knocked me up altogether.
So, July 1st, that's the day of this. Most Brits would, if you were to ask them what the saddest, the most forlorn day in their history of that long country, that ancient country, they would say it's July 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. The Third Army results in the northern portion basically ended up in failure, but the casualties were rather low. But you get here from this region right here all the way down to the road here between Albert and Bapaume. This is where the casualties for the 4th British Army were horrendous, absolutely horrendous. Below the road, this region right here, the 13th Corps attack was much more successful. And when you get down to the French sector, who had a lot more heavy artillery and a little bit more sophisticated infantry tactics, they did much, much better. So the decision is made by Haig and others. Let's reinforce success. Let's move our future attacks through here. But the decision has to be made. Do we continue the attacks? Just like in the Battle of Verdun, they didn't really feel it. I don't think they felt like they had too many choices. They were getting a lot of pressure from politicians in London, and especially a lot of pressure from their French allies to continue the attack, to take the pressure off the Verdun. And so they decided to attack. Now, casualties for the 4th British Army, 19,240 killed in one day. And you add in the rest of the Brits, you got close to 20,000. 57,400 total casualties of about 100,000 that were initially employed. That's a huge percentage. The French casualties, something like 1,590. The Germans, the numbers vary widely in the German case, but maybe 10 to 12,000 casualties. One particular battalion suffered 684 casualties, 91%. The Chums lost right at 60%. 15 officers dead or missing or wounded, 487 men altogether, so horrendous casualties. But one of the problems, and again, this is a communications breakdown, what do the generals think the casualties are at the end of day one? 16,000 dead, maybe. And the expectations were this is going to be bloody, we're going to lose a lot of people, but 16,000 is what they thought. It would take days before they'd be able to sort all this out. So yes, they would continue the assault. And one more quote here from a private from the 4th.
On the far side of no man's land, I found the German wire cut, but only 3 of our company got past there. There was my lieutenant, a sergeant, and myself. The rest seemed to have been hit in no man's land. The officer said, God, where's the rest of the boys?
I think that pretty much says it all. So, how long does the sum last? From July 1st all the way up to November 18th. Months and months of combat. And I don't want to spend too much time going through this. We pretty much painted the picture I wanted to achieve. One thing that's significant of this 141-day campaign is September 15th is the first use of tanks during World War I. It's an experiment. The Brits started rather early on this. In the fall of 1914, Churchill was one of the early champions of this. Though he was Lord of the Admiralty, he kind of took that under his arm. 49 tanks were available on the 15th. Only 18 of them got into no man's land in the first place. All the rest of them broke down on the way to the battlefield. And it didn't take long for the rest of them to be rather easy targets because they moved at 1/2 mile per hour. So, but it's shock. And again, the Brits weren't ready to exploit it even if they had been more successful. So the lessons of the first, July 1st, was you needed much better coordination with the artillery. You needed much better observation capability. You had to solve the communications problem. That was a conundrum that they never really got a good handle on. And then you had to deal with the psychological impact of this. And as I mentioned, it was the darkest day of England's long, long history. Basil Liddell Hart called it a tragedy of errors. A.J.P. Taylor, these are both major military historians after the war. He called it the day that idealism perished on the Somme. And here's another interesting footnote. One of the casualties on the German side was a young man, 27-year-old corporal by the name of Adolf Hitler. He was a casualty at the Somme. Now, I hesitate to even put these casualty figures up because when I started to do the research, the casualty numbers were just all over the map. But I wanted to give some sense of the scale of the loss and the impact that this is going to have on European society for generations afterwards. Just on the Somme itself, for that 5-month campaign, 415,000 Brits, 202,000 French. The numbers for the Germans, anywhere from 430 to 650,000. Who knows? So well in excess of 1 million casualties for the Battle of the Somme. And I started thinking about why the numbers were all over the map. Well, did they include prisoners of war? Did they include missing? We talked about the missing that were in these battles. Did it include a person being injured in July, coming back to the battle, being injured again later on, or being killed later on? How do you count this stuff up? So I offer those cautionary tales for these numbers. But the fact is that it was a traumatic experience for Britain, for France, and for Germany. And it was a battle of attrition, a war of attrition now, which army was going to break first. And that's a conversation for future presentations, I think. Now, you see the cemetery at Nivelle. I've actually visited that cemetery. What's in that cemetery? 72,246 missing British Empire servicemen who died somewhere between 1916 and 1918 on the battlefield of the Somme. That's 72,000 people who couldn't be identified, just found on the battlefield. I'd like to encourage you to get a real sense of it in a different kind of a format with what I consider the classic film of the First World War. And even though it came out in 1930, it stands up incredibly well. All Quiet on the Western Front, that shows July 26th, right here in this theater again. Very brief introduction, and then we'll have a chance to see a movie that was so powerful that the Nazis banned it from theaters. Because like every First World War movie, it's an anti-war movie. How could it be anything else? Thank you very much for coming here tonight. And give credit to our narrators as well. So, I always do this. I have a terrible reputation, but I went over longer than I thought. Hopefully, I appreciate you staying with it. Do I have any questions? All the way in the back there. Yes, sir. Okay, the question is, I think I understand it, why did the British decide to join in this battle? Is that what you're talking about the decision in 1914, right?
Well, I'm talking about their effort to align with the French against the Germans.
Okay.
Why did they not remain isolationist because of their...
The British weren't quite as tied into the alliance, the pattern of alliances in 1914 as the French and the Russians were, but the British did have an ironclad treaty with the Belgians that if they were ever attacked, that the Brits would come to their aid. And so, because of the Schlieffen Plan, to begin with, had the German army marching right through Belgium to get to the soft underbelly of France, as soon as Belgium neutrality was violated, that led to the decision for the British to come in a major way. The problem was it took them practically 2 years in the Battle of the Somme to really have a major military presence in Europe at that time. Yes, right here, sir.
Am I getting the name confused, but was General Petain, was he part of the Vichy government?
General Petain has a very interesting history. He is the hero of Verdun because of this defensive strategy that he had. A year later, after the Battle of Verdun, not Petain, not Jafra, but General Nivelle comes to be the commander-in-chief of the French army. He is also very offensive-minded. And General Nivelle, in 1917, launches another major offensive. This time the Germans are in the defensive, the French are on the offensive. We've got to repel the hated Huns from from French soil. That offensive is an absolute disaster. And after that offensive in 1917, you see something in the neighborhood of half the French divisions, elements in half the French divisions, mutiny and refuse to go on the offensive. They might decide that it's okay to be on the defensive, but that's a huge psychological impact on the French, and General Pétain comes back into the picture. Nivelle is fired, Pétain comes in, some very harsh disciplinary actions are taken, but he ends up being the hero in that respect as well. And for the rest of the war, the French are pretty much just waiting for the Americans to arrive. So now you fast forward another generation, you get to the beginning of World War II, and all the trauma that the French had experienced, I think, has a lot to say about why the French army collapsed at the beginning of World War II the way it did. And who is left to be in charge of the French government after the collapse? Retired General Pétain. So he's in charge of the Vichy government, like you mentioned.
Did Kaiser Bill have, because of the British royalty being from Germany, did that have any,
Can you ask the question again?
was there any problem because of British royalty being, German and with Kaiser Bill? Was there a problem, like I said, with their...
Well, the last time we had the presentation about the origins of war, you know that all of these royal families were interrelated. All of them were. And once the opening shots fired, they kind of put all that behind them. The people rallied behind their particular government, their particular army. So that wasn't a problem after that. I saw a question up here. Yes, sir.
On the radio, you said that sometime you were going to talk about how the Germans had figured out how to get away from the French warfare. Will that be in one of these future ones, as you kind of alluded?
It is. If you've got your handout here, the question is, how do the Germans, how does anybody figure out how to break out of trench warfare? And that is a subject for 2018. 2008. So all you have to do is wait 2 years for that one. Yes, sir, right here.
You hear a lot about PTSD today. How was that condition dealt with troops coming back?
PBS came out with a series on World War I a couple years ago, and it was much more about the human impact of World War I than it was about armies moving around on the battlefield. And they have these gut-wrenching films of these soldiers who came back, and they would crawl under a table and they would just have this twitch constantly and all these things. Shell shock, that's the term that was used for this one. And certainly not nearly the understanding that we have today. I sometimes wonder if there was something different about that generation. They dealt with it better or differently, or the World War II generation that they dealt with it differently. But in most cases, it was much more in the closet. That was the kind of thing that they didn't talk about. But just horrendous kind of experiences. And it wasn't uncommon at all that you see people on the streets of London or any major English city with missing an arm or a leg or both arms and things like that. So it was certainly a factor then. And plenty of soldiers were psychologically injured as well. Yes?
I had an uncle, a great uncle, that was in the World War I with the carrying the soldiers, and what am I trying to say? Ambulance. And when he got into his dementia late in his life, that's when he turned into some of this war.
Okay. So the comment is that her
Great uncle.
great uncle was in the ambulance corps during World War I, and only at the end, towards the end of his life, he started to see.
In his dementia, he would bring that back.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the human mind is an awfully difficult thing to understand, and how could anybody not be affected by the nature of the combat that they had? Yes, sir, back here.
Have you been to the World War I museum in Kansas City?
Question is that I've been to the World War I museum in Kansas City. Yes, I have.
I went a year and a half ago, and they had a gentleman like yourself doing a presentation, and he drew an interesting conclusion of this war was basically created by national fervor of every country, right? He was drawing a correlation in modern times with maybe like the South China Sea. Do you see a correlation with that? Or is that a far stretch?
Do I see a correlation between the intense nationalism that they had during the First World War with the kind of nationalism we might be seeing in places like the North China Sea that the Chinese might have, the Filipinos and the Vietnamese. Normally I would steer clear of that kind of a question. I'll make this comment. I made the statement up front that the most significant historical event of the last 2 centuries was this war. Well, what happened before that? It was the French Revolution. And what did the French Revolution unleash? They spread the concept of nationalism through the rest of Europe. All these countries that were ruled by kings and emperors, and suddenly these people started realizing, wait a minute, we have our own national identity. Look what happened in the Balkans after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. It is an incredibly powerful human force. And I don't think human nature has changed that much, so it's still a factor today.
I thought that was an excellent point that he brought up. And he said the exact same thing, that this, as far as historical, we don't put a lot of importance on this, but if you look at modern politics, a lot of it, especially the Middle East, the boundaries and all that were drawn out of this war, and we're dealing with this 100 years later. He brought up exactly the same.
Yeah. And everybody's got their own theory about why the Brexit vote went the way it did, but nationalism certainly is part of that, I think. Maybe one more question here. Yes, sir.
When you fire 1 million shells at a small area, why doesn't it kill everybody?
A lot of, especially for the British, most of those shells were on relatively smaller caliber guns. And if you're in a bunker that's 20 or 30 feet under the ground that's been reinforced, doesn't matter how many of those rounds are going to land on top of you, you're still going to be fine. It's the larger caliber guns that are really going to start digging you out or collapse the bunkers or seal people in, and horrific things did happen. There were certainly plenty of the Germans that were killed in that bombardment, but nothing close to the scale that the Brits wanted. And, if a third of your rounds never even go off in the first place, then it's a serious problem. But it was because the Germans were good engineers to begin with, and they built this elaborate bunker system. Primarily, that's the reason. Okay, thank you very much for coming.